recording. All right, so welcome everyone today. This is a Community Garden Network's session with Ron Lewis. And so the idea here today is we hope to sort of garner all kinds of tips and really interesting thoughts on how to put our gardens to bed for the fall, going into the winter. What are some of the important things we need to consider, and sharing tips and suggestions, because as we know as gardeners, we're always learning all the time. So our special guest this evening is Ron Lewis, and many of you will know Ron. But just to let you know, in case you don't, he's been organic gardening for many, many years. And so a seasoned gardener for sure, I would say. And he also has experience with fruit trees. But tonight, really, our topic is about the gardening, as in vegetables and everything that we've planted in our community gardens or home gardens. Ron has had fun basically also presenting to like the Hort Society and in different spots. So he's always learning, and of course very eager to share some information with us tonight. So Ron, welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah. And so as you heard, we want to talk about putting those gardens to bed for the fall. So I wonder if you could sort of maybe just give us sort of an overall thought on where people would get started with that kind of thing and what that would cover.
I'll try and keep my overall thought from using up the whole hour. One thing I do this time of year is I'm always correcting people who speak of gardening in the past tense. Because I'm still gardening, I still have not only chores to do to prepare for next year, but also things to harvest, like Brussels sprouts that are best when they're harvested in cool weather. So yeah, anyway, I'll make it short though. This time of year, preparing for next year, I would, and I already have started actually tilling, that's rototilling my soil. And some of you are just using mulch, so that's a whole different story. And then the next thing I would do would be to spread manure. If I can find some chicken manure, bagged sheep manure, whatever's available, that's what I use. It has to go down next, because if you were to put down leaves and then threw manure on top of the leaves, the manure would just disappear and you wouldn't be able to tell where you'd put it as you're doing it. So I'm waiting for my neighbors to rake up and bag the leaves. And then when they put them out for pickup, I'll take as much as I can handle and spread them on the garden. For a number of reasons. Well, it adds organic matter and it's free. But also it sort of insulates the soil a little bit, keeps it from freezing and thawing too much, if that's an issue with perennials. And I don't till the leaves in very deeply, only maybe a couple of inches. I'm just stirring the soil with leaves on top, trying to make the leaves dirty. So I'll call it inoculating the leaves with soil bacteria. And the soil bacteria do the job for me. They feed the plant. I feed the bacteria, they feed the plants. That's the way I look at it anyway. Yeah. So, yeah, well, there are certain special things, but I don't think we want to get into item by item, like strawberries or garlic, which only got planted a few days ago.
Yeah, well, I thought what you just said was a great way to sort of start overall, is just you're identifying that right away you're going to be working with the soil, and you're also doing some form of soil amendment and coverage there, if I understood correctly.
Yes, that's right. That's
exactly. So I wonder if maybe we'd want to sort of see if anyone has questions surrounding those particular items, like right away.
Okay.
And then to kind of see how the conversation develops.
I've got a question, Ron, it's Leanne. So today, hi, so I just put all my leaves out on my garden today, but I didn't think to till them into the first, like to the top layer of the soil and manure. So I'm wondering if they're just sitting on top, are they going to compost, you think, by the spring, or should I actually maybe kind of stir them up a bit?
Well, as with most questions I'm asked, there's more than one answer. If those are what are called annual weeds, they would be producing seed every year, and you actually may not want to till them back in. They'd be better off thrown in the compost heap where they'll decompose first. If
Oh,
you,
sorry. I think my hand was over the speaker there. It's the leaves. I spread the
yeah.
leaves, but
Oh,
I didn't stir the leaves into the soil. Should I be doing that?
Well, if you believe in what I said then about inoculating them, then yes, they will
Yeah.
compost. So worms actually come up from depths to the soil surface, and then they will draw leaves down into the ground for you. But I don't know to what degree they would do that. So I would be inclined, if I had time and if I had the means, to stir them into the soil myself. Just a little bit though. It's still, when I'm all through with that and the tiller's gone over them, it still looks like there's leaves on top of the garden. Until
Okay.
spring. Then they'll
Yeah.
get tilled in.
And then Ron, just to go along with that particular question. So basically in the chat, we have Rochelle asking if you use grass along with your leaves, is that, in your opinion, like a good mix?
Well, yeah, and sometimes I run across that myself because I'm picking up bags of leaves and lo and behold, there's a bag of just grass clippings. So I have to decide whether I want them or not. And again, that's a little bit complicated because if people are using herbicides to kill the dandelions and that kind of thing, you're going to end up with some of that in your grass. And if you want to stick to organic methods, then possibly you want to turn down that grass. That's what I would do. But I have also a couple of neighbors that I know that don't use herbicides at all or pesticides or anything on their grass, and they just mow it and then they throw it over the fence into my compost heap for me. So I would use that, but you have to be careful, even if it's good grass, you have to be careful that you don't use a lot, because what it will do is it will cake, it will just turn into a slimy mess. Whereas you want to just sort of sprinkle grass in layers among other things. I don't know how to quantify it other than that, but you'll just learn from experience what's too much and what's okay. But if it's getting slimy, wet, sticky, clumpy, then you've got too much grass.
Right.
But it is good fertilizer. It's excellent fertilizer.
So mulched grass might be the approach, but peppering it, kind of peppering it throughout everything instead of solid chunks.
Yeah, spreading it thinly, right? Yeah, like I wouldn't take a forkful or a shovelful and throw it somewhere. I would try to probably spread it by hand, just so sprinkling it, as you say, peppering it.
Well, that's very interesting. Good to know. So then getting on with that, like, are there some plants, because we can see there's another question here that's could go along with this as well, is like, do all the plants have to come out? Is it detrimental to let them just decompose in the soil on their own and just go ahead and do this part on top?
Yeah, again, good and bad, depends. I'll give you a couple of answers. Let's say you have cabbage family plants, then they sometimes carry disease that would spread throughout the garden the next year if you were to till them into the soil. So they're better off composted first, because the heating that goes on when you're creating a compost heap tends to kill those organisms. And annual weeds are bad because they would be full of seeds. Like right now, I've got a garden full of chickweed and it's producing more seeds. So if I were to turn it in, then I get more chickweed first thing next spring, probably before anything else is growing. Yeah, so I don't know, did I answer that?
Well, I think that's
Correct.
one type of answer depending on the plants, right? So
Yeah.
I don't know, Chris, if you have, are you speaking of actual vegetable plants? Like I've often heard that peas and beans, the roots can be really great for the soil.
Yes.
So I'm not sure if Chris Lynn might be referring to that.
Yeah.
But
So
could you
a big
maybe
yes to
touch on
that.
that?
Yeah, big yes to peas and beans. And then I think it makes me think of potatoes and tomatoes that would have big tops. And if they are just left even on the soil surface or somewhere in a compost heap, they disintegrate tremendously, or they shrivel up, they dehydrate tremendously and become much less of volume. If you're trying to use a rototiller or even trying to dig things in, some of those really massive objects like a potato top or a tomato top would be really hard to handle in the fall and easy to handle in the spring.
Hmm.
So I think I'd put them aside. I toss things onto the grass beside my garden beds or into a compost heap and just wait on some things like those. But small items and peas and beans are the best example you give of things that you would want to turn in because they're improving your soil and they're not too big. They're not going to wind around the tines of the rototiller or give you other problems.
Do any other vegetable plants come to mind? Like when I speak of peas and beans, are there any others that you'd put in that same category?
For turning in the fall, the peas and the beans, what they have in common is that they're both legumes. So they have drawn nitrogen out of the air, incorporated into their own roots, and now they're giving it back to the soil as they decompose over the winter. So those would be the main ones, but I really can't think. Maybe you could remind me better, or someone could remind me of what else there might be that you might leave there. But I think that most of the things have pretty big tops, and it's too much for my tiller to easily handle, and it's not something I'd want to do by hand. So
Yeah.
I think
No,
it's
I think
not much more than peas and beans.
yeah, that sounds about right. That's about the only two that I learned that you could do that with. Colleen has her hand up. Colleen.
Okay, way to go.
Okay, so I'm just thinking specifically like about, you mentioned the brassica vegetables, but I'm thinking about like broccoli. So you've grown this massive plant with this massive stalk.
Yeah.
So what, like, in order to get those roots out, like you're pulling up huge volumes of and disturbing your soil. Like that's the one I always wonder about. Do you just hack off the stem of the plant and then I try to compost that? But
Yeah. Were you talking about broccoli?
those
Did you
big
say?
rooted vegetables?
I didn't quite get the word. Was it broccoli you gave
Yeah,
us?
broccoli.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and corn is another one where it would even be harder to pull out the roots. So what I would tend to do, I have a scythe, right, an old-fashioned blade on a stick sort of thing, and I would cut the tops off, move the tops off the garden surface, and leave the roots. So the roots will usually rot, or at least if they're not completely rotten, they'll be a lot easier to work with next spring if they've spent the winter in the garden. Plus, the roots tend to hold your garden together, so the soil wouldn't wash away in big rainstorms that we might have between now and say May next year.
That's a very good point. Did that, was that a good answer there, Colleen, for you? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's clears that one up. Sorry, and I just lost Rochelle's question, but I just lost my.
Okay.
You'll think of it
Yeah.
when I talk. You'll think of it. What I did, because I
Yeah.
did like these tomatillos and ground cherries and tomatoes, and I'm not planning to till at all. So I just took my snips and I cut everything at ground level.
Yeah.
And I'm just throwing the tops, getting rid of the tops, and just leaving them in there. Every time I dig up any kind of dandelion or whatever, there's always worms wrapped up in the roots. So I just thought this year I'm going to experiment with leaving as many roots in the ground as possible. And I don't know, next year I guess we'll have to see how it works. But
Yeah. And this year, like, even if you didn't think that way and you thought you might want to till everything in the fall, even if you're using a motorized rototiller, it's probably going to bounce off those roots. It's not going to do a whole lot of the kind of chopping and integrating into the soil that you're really hoping to do. But in the spring, those things cooperate that way a lot better.
Mm-hmm. Very
I
interesting.
thought of my question. So a lot of us are working with the above ground beds, raised beds.
Yes.
So is there any consideration between how we treat beds in the soil versus raised beds?
Well, yeah, that's a good question for tripping me up. I'll have to think hard. I have not done any raised beds per se. I've raised, made rows a little bit higher so I don't have to bend over so far to do the weeding, but raised beds is something I just see other people do. And first thing is, obviously, you're not going to get any equipment like a rototiller into a raised bed, probably. It'd have to be awfully big. So that wouldn't be a factor. And then I also know that some of the local gardeners, especially in the community gardens, are leaning towards mulching, right? Like a permanent mulch. What's it called? A no-till garden, right? So-called. And in that case, you're just adding more mulch every spring, whatever you happen to have. Well, compost would be the best. So that's a lot different from what I do. I think that was your question, right? What do you do differently in raised beds? So if your style is to mulch, then you're not going to be either, not going to be necessarily even pulling stuff out, except maybe the tops. And instead you're piling stuff on top, and you can do that in the fall or in the spring, or both.
Now, Ron, I could add to that a little bit, as you and I had talked about in the past. So at Westmount Community Garden, we did decide, I think it was the year before last, to leave all the roots in the raised beds. And these are like 4x4 boxes.
Yeah.
And because some of our heritage tomatoes become so large, and the roots I had on some of our plants were like just so large, they did not decompose through the winter.
Yeah.
And I just found when we went to pop in some plants in some of the boxes, they were actually in the way. So it turned out that in many cases, I had to pull them out and just pull them out in the spring. Now, you had said something very interesting to me when we were kind of talking about this a little bit. You said that because up here, our soil freezes so much harder, there might be some of these considerations when thinking about no-till. But equally in a garden box, what I found is those particular roots did not decompose at all through the winter.
Yeah, they would be dead though, wouldn't they? So that if you are making room beside them to plant something new next spring, although they're in the way, they don't really compete with the plant that's going in beside them. So maybe they take longer than just one winter to decompose, and they may still not be posing any big problem. But you'd have to learn that on your own. I mean, I cannot make it up, and I haven't got the experience with raised gardens to be sure. But just one more point on your idea about the freezing. The raised bed is going to freeze more. The raised bed is off the ground, so it's more exposed, and probably the entire block of soil that's in that bed is going to freeze solid.
Yes, I would agree with that. Definitely. I don't know, did anyone else have, like, I know Sarah's saying here that in French River, they definitely pull all their plants out of their garden boxes. Speaking of like mostly tomato plants, zucchinis, potatoes, and beans. So like what I'm hearing out of all of this is perhaps try leaving some of the roots in if you'd like to experiment with that. Because from what I understand, that aerates the soil and it enriches the soil, especially something like peas and beans. Yeah.
And on the other side of things, maybe people like me like to do everything they can in the fall because springs are so hectic that whatever can be done in the fall is one less thing I have to do in the spring. But that's all personal thing. It depends on your own style. And you have to decide for yourself when you want to do those things.
Yes, very good point. Colleen and Rochelle?
Okay, Ron touched on this, mentioned it a few minutes ago about seed control, saying that he had a lot of chickweed in his garden. This is a little bit weird because Ron's just sitting right over there, you know, so we get a little bit of feedback going on.
Okay, I'm
I'm
good
going to
now.
ask my question this way. So
Yeah.
what can we do to sort of limit seed propagation in the fall? Like some people talk about putting cardboard down and then putting manure and like doing
Actually, sorry, it was better when you talked into the computer.
Okay, so there's my question is, should we try to control seeds with cardboard, like laying a layer of cardboard on the bed and then putting compost or manure on top of that so that we kind of limit what the seed growth is that's already in the soil?
Yeah, I tend to do that in spring, and I'm trying to think of whether there's a reason why it would have to be spring and not fall, and I don't think I can come up with one. So it would be more or less just when you have time or when it fits your schedule best. Yeah, I mean, the cardboard is great for smothering weeds, that is for sure. I use them mainly around berry bushes and fruit trees. So, but if you're trying to go between garden rows, yes. But you know what? If you put cardboard down now and you were thinking of rototilling later, then the cardboard has to come up and get out of the way of the rototiller. So, you know, you're duplicating the work. Again, it depends on the style. If you're just mulching and using no-till gardening, then it would matter a lot less when you put the cardboard down at your convenience.
That's a good point. That's a very good point. So like a lot of what I'm hearing too, I feel, is that not only are there certain tips based on whether you're actually in the ground or in the garden box, but also taking into consideration workload sometimes between the fall and spring, like time of year, what you can manage might also be like a factor to consider, right?
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, that's a good, very good point. I do have another question for you here, Ron.
Okay.
Do you, in your experience, do you know if squirrels will dig up the garlic in the fall? I'm assuming, Leanne, you mean in the fall.
Well, if my experience includes listening to other people, then I've heard that it has happened. I haven't had any problems with garlic myself at all, ever. Not any kind. Well, except there's a new insect around now, but I don't want to get into that. But no, as for squirrels, I hardly have any squirrels around. I have never identified any squirrel damage to anything. So it depends so much, I'm sure, on whether they're present in your yard or not. So
yeah, that's a good point, because
anyway,
they will typically go after some bulbs. And I think that's maybe what Leanne is thinking of.
yes.
Yeah, did you want to add anything to that, Leanne? Like your thoughts on that?
Well, I planted all my garlic between last week and now, and I just see squirrels are like dancing on top of the place where I put them. And I've never had squirrels dig up garlic before, but I don't know. Yeah, that's all.
Sounds like that's what they're doing, though,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Yeah.
Does
Leanne,
anyone know any deterrents actually? Like, I was thinking of putting cardboard on top of the garlic just for now until the snow comes, and then I could take it off again. But does anyone have any tips for keeping them safe?
Yeah, there are commercial products. Something Be Gone, I forget what they're called, but they would have a bloody smell, so that if it's not a predator that eats other animals that would have blood, then it's repelled by the blood.
Okay.
There's a lot of things like that for rabbits and so on. The other thing I do, I think this is what I would try, but I don't know if it worked because I don't have squirrels, but what I would try would be cayenne pepper. I have used cayenne pepper around my corn and sprayed my apple trees with it when I have had bears around, or raccoons, or even rabbits. And
Yeah.
as far as I can tell, it repels those things. So it just seems
Hmm.
the first thing that comes to mind when I hear you say squirrels is, what about some, cayenne pepper? You can buy cayenne pepper at bulk stores, so it's not very expensive that way at all.
Okay. I see Rochelle just said chicken wire too, and I do have some chicken wire.
Hmm.
Lay the chicken wire on the ground over the garlic patch. Is that the idea, Rochelle? Oops. Okay. Well, I think that's it anyway.
Yes, yes, it is.
Okay.
And you can either take it off in the spring, or your garlic will just, if it's the thicker chicken wire, will just kind of, the tops will grow right through.
Yes. And that's okay now, but what about cultivating it then if you've got weeds to pull? Is the chicken wire the only thing on top of the soil surface?
What do you mean the only thing? Like if
Well, I
it's,
mean, you don't have another mulch or anything like that. So the garlic would poke through the chicken wire, but what would stop the weeds from germinating right beside the garlic?
yeah, well, I've done that when there's been squirrels, and we have a lot of hares around. I want to discourage the rabbits from
Yeah.
getting in, and they're out and about running across our street right now.
Okay.
So I put it, like, whatever you're going to do, just put the chicken wire on top, and then I leave it there until the spring, and then start taking it off then.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's certainly, this would be the time of year. Animals have the time of year for doing various things, different kinds of mischief they get into. And so, yeah, if you deter them in the fall, there's a good chance they won't be around in the spring. They'll be distracted, attracted to something else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. So, I mean, generally, I'm thinking that, most people like to see that nice, clean garden in the fall. Like they're going to generally pull up most of their plants, get them into the compost. And yet, I hear about putting compost down in the fall. So, I know we've talked about leaf mulch.
Mhm.
But are there any general soil amendments that you would almost put down every single time in the fall? Like you
Well,
mentioned chicken manure, right?
yeah. The idea of putting compost in the fall, I'll think of a couple of pluses for it. If you've got a compost pile, although the compost pile generates its own heat, after a winter in northern Ontario, it's going to be frozen. So you're not going to be able to use it right away in the spring. Also, while it's working and giving off this heat, it's also giving off some nitrogen into the air. In other words, it's losing some fertility. Probably not a major amount. Otherwise, I don't think people would compost. But if you tried putting it on in the spring, you're going to. If you tried putting it on in the fall instead of the spring, so that you're not having to deal with the freezing problem at that time, then the certain amount of decomposition will take place, and you would lose a certain amount of the fertility in the fall, but not very much because temperatures are so cool that the bacterial activity in the compost is not as great as it would be during a major part of the growing season. So that's one thing. And I wanted to say something about corn tops. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So another reason for leaving things on the soil surface in the fall would be to catch snow. So I don't cut down my corn stalks until the spring, hoping that they're going to give me a slightly deeper layer of snow on top of the corn patch. And that means maybe more water is absorbed by the soil in the spring.
Oh, good point. Wow. I wouldn't have thought of that. Of course, I don't grow corn. Does anyone else here grow corn? Any of the gardens? No?
Yeah, Rochelle grows corn.
We've had some at the Walden Garden, but we kind of forgot about it this year.
Yeah.
We tried a Three Sisters garden this year. So there was a little bit of corn, but it's not like we did like a whole 10 by 10 patch.
Mhm.
Interesting. Yeah. No, that's good to know. So, I mean, I've also heard about checking the pH of the soil and to do that in the fall.
Okay, yeah. Well, I'm not a big fan of chemistry, and that's where I would classify it, but I am aware that pH is a factor, especially in Greater Sudbury, where we've had pollution for so many years and acid rain. So I'm almost sounding like I'm contradicting myself, but although I don't like the NPK type, you know, 3 numbers on the bag of fertilizer type thing as information, and pH, though, I would make an exception for that, because you can almost be guaranteed that your soil in Greater Sudbury needs lime to neutralize the low pH of the acidic soil. Now, just 2 weeks ago, there was a historic article about the Sudbury Regreening program that was particularly strong in the 1970s. And I'll just mention that what they did to counter acid rain effects in the wild, you know, wherever they were, and planting trees, was they dumped enormous amounts of pulverized limestone on the ground there. In fact, that's the only thing I know for sure that they did. I know they did more than that, but that's the only detail that I'm aware of. So we need the lime. Now, there's only 1 or 2 bad things about lime. Lime and potatoes don't mix very well. Your potatoes are likely to be scabbier if you have limed the soil, and strawberries don't like lime too much either, but I've heard of people using it, and they probably get away with it because we have such acidic soils in the Sudbury area. And I don't really see a lot of other people using lime. When I talk to people about lime, they seem to think that that's a little bit foreign, or exotic or something. I don't know what, but it's actually been used for centuries. It's organic because it's just the skeletons of former sea creatures that ended up at the bottom of the sea and got compressed into rock over many, many eons, I guess. So I don't see a downside to it, except that you don't want to bring your soil pH up too fast, especially in a potato patch. And then I have to add to that, though, caution. There are other types of lime that are available in agricultural situations: slaked lime, quicklime. Quicklime can ruin your soil because it is so chemically reactive that it can lock up nutrients in your soil. And so you'd want to be sure that you're just simply applying crushed limestone. It could be dolomitic, which means it has some magnesium as well as calcium.
Okay, so dolomitic lime, I have seen that at the gardening stores.
Yeah.
Generally, the bag's not very big, eh, Ron?
Well, no, not very big. You can lift it. It's maybe they come in 2 different sizes, but they're pretty light.
Okay.
It's easy to handle. You just sprinkle, and you only have to use it every few years. If you have sandy soil, maybe every 4 years. If you have a clay soil, maybe every 6 years.
Okay.
It's not something you would do every year anyway. That's my point. What I tend to do more than anything else, I think, is I add it to my compost. You know how you make compost in layers: a layer of leaves, a layer of grass clippings, a layer of soil, and a little handful of lime sprinkled in there.
And actually, Ron, I was just about to mention that because Leanne asked that very question. She said, if I add lime to my compost pile, will it decompose faster, was her question.
Yes, it will, because one of the things that lime does is it stimulates the microbial activity in the soil. So yeah, excellent for compost heaps. Highly recommended.
Oh, excellent question, Leanne. Thanks for asking that, because that clarifies even more. Very good. So Karen's asking, do you think it's a good idea to dump dried grass and brown leaves? And okay, so we had this question already, Karen. But maybe Ron, if you don't mind, maybe you could just recap that. Is it a good idea to dump, this is dried grass and brown leaves on top of the vegetable garden in the fall?
I would say yes to both if you have them. And I just have to bring bring myself to recall a story. I was once talking to the Horticultural Society, and I made the mistake of not knowing the different proportions of those things. Now, dried grass, are you meaning brown grass then? Yeah, I guess so, eh?
I think that's, Karen, did you want to speak to that? Or like if you don't want to, it's fine. I'm going to assume you mean by dried grass, like you left it somewhere, it dried up, it's not green anymore. So yeah, let's go with that, Ron.
Okay. Well, more leaves than grass then. You're still going to have the same problem that I mentioned earlier. Although I was talking about green grass at the time, even the dried grass would tend to clump and get sticky and slimy once it gets wet. So the dried grass just gets sprinkled on, and the dried leaves can be heaped onto the garden. You can't have too much, really, as far as leaves go, because they will decompose fairly fast in the growing season. I'll give you an example. Last fall, I didn't get my leaves put on the garden, so I had to do it this spring. So they would have been applied probably in May, and by mid to late June, there was no evidence at all that there were any leaves in my ground. So that means they decomposed quite quickly. The dried grass is excellent. It has very good fertilizing. It carries a lot of good nutrients, but it is just a little bit trickier because of its tendency to clump and get slimy and so on. So you have to be more reserved in your use of that.
Yes, yes. So there's the key. And that's something that I did not realize is, you know, I just know growing up on a farm, Dad always said, get that grass out of there. And it was not allowed to go near the vegetable garden once we weeded. And that was because he said it'll just replant itself. That's how he felt it. It would just keep on reseeding itself.
I think I disagree, but it's probably a different situation what I'm thinking of. When you're mowing your lawn and you've got grass clippings all the time, the grass has not had time to form any seeds. All you're doing is chopping up the leaves of the grass plants. But if you had, say, hay is bad.
Yes.
Hay has the seeds at the end of the stalk, and they are going to reseed themselves, and so you're going to have a weed problem that you're created by doing that. Oat straw usually not, but if the straw hasn't been properly threshed, then there could be more oat seeds in it than you were bargaining for. But yeah, they would also be the same problem, but they're really easy to pull out of the ground.
Yes.
By the time they're about 6 inches tall, they've only got about an inch of root, and you can easily pull them out or rake them out or something like that. Pull them out.
That's great. That's really good to know. Colleen and Rochelle have a question, actually, getting back to garlic.
Okay, yes.
Is it necessary to mulch garlic? So
I would say no, but I do.
You do, eh?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. And again, just with your same materials?
Yeah, so the way I like to plant garlic, now I've actually put garlic in the ground a few days ago, and I did not have all those materials on hand, but I still intend to do it when I can. But on the other hand, to answer your question, no, I don't think it's necessary. I think it's just kind of a bonus. Garlic is super hardy. The only reason we plant it in the fall is so that it gets a cold shock that'll make it sprout. If you tried planting in the spring when it's warm, it might not sprout. But anyway, here's my way of planting garlic. I'll plant it in the rows and then take some bags of leaves that my neighbors have kindly raked up for me, and I dump them onto let's say a thickness, I'll say 4 inches, 10 centimeters roughly. But you know, give or take, really.
Yeah.
But I don't believe in precision when it comes to things like that. Now, the problem is that sometime between now and next spring, the leaves will dry up, and after they thaw out, they might blow away. So I like to put some oat straw on top of the leaves to hold them down. Okay, now that could create a problem, especially if you go very much beyond the 4 inches of that I recommended for the leaf layer. The garlic has to find its way through that. With Rochelle's way of having chicken wire on top, not much problem, right? There's lots of space for them to go. But here's what I found. I used to get worried when I first started doing this because it looked like the tops of my garlic would grow sideways, unable to find an opening to go up. And so I'd go through it by hand, and I would try to straighten things out that way. And then one year I was off to work in Toronto for weeks, and I wasn't around to do that. And every last one of the garlic bulbs that I had planted found its own way. It might not be good to let that happen, though, because it might delay the garlic a little bit. It loses a couple of weeks of that good growing weather in the spring. But other than that, it's not a big deal. So I like to mulch it because I'm giving organic matter back to the soil. But also, wait till I tell you this. So this is where you start finding out how weird I actually am as a gardener. So I have the garlic patch mulched with leaves and straw. It completely covers the patch. And then, and that's in, say, fall. Could be October, could be later. The garlic doesn't then get harvested until roughly first week in August. Meanwhile, I have never, not once, weeded the garlic patch nor watered it, because the mulch keeps the moisture in, keeps the weeds down. If I could mulch my whole garden like that, I would, but
yes.
it just seems to fit my style, I guess, if you can say I have a style, but the idea of doing as much as I can in the fall.
Yeah, that seems to make a lot of sense probably for many of us. We seem to need a break once in a while, but with all the planning that's going to take place for spring, of course, when you hit the road running in the spring, it must be such a good feeling, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm just going to finish up on the garlic with one more mention. So it was mentioned that, so Colleen, like the garlic is getting some kind of root rot. And I'm sort of assuming from this that it may have been mulched before, but she's going to move it to a brand new spot and just trying to figure out, should it be mulched there? And so you've answered a lot of the mulching, but I just wonder, is there any kind of comment you can make on maybe this root rot that is coming up in the garlic?
I don't think I have much to help other people. I have a friend who gardens in Sudbury, and we're comparing notes all the time. And he had a good crop of garlic this year, and it rotted while it was drying out in his shed.
Oh.
And so he threw the whole thing away. So I'm not really sure because, unless you have a problem yourself, you're not too likely to wonder what I should do if something happens that has never happened. I've been growing garlic probably, I don't know, about 18 years or something. And I can't think of anything except for this new insect that I could talk about. If you want,
Okay.
But not root rot. Sorry, no help with root rot.
Yeah, so Colleen, I don't know, or Rochelle, if you had any more comments to make on that.
Oh, let me just say one more thing before you do. I have sort of an overall concern about how much watering people do. So I've got a feeling that some problems like that could be caused by the impulse everyone seems to have to water, water, water. And maybe I don't get it because I don't water. I don't know.
What I noticed is I was always planting garlic up near the house, and then I moved it down near the pond where it's warmer, but it's much wetter. So I never water anything. If God rains on it, that's all the water any of my plants ever get. And so I was wondering if it might have to do with the wetness of the area, but it kind of did really beautiful. And then just before harvest, it just got all mushy. And so this year I moved it. I didn't plant that much because I was disorganized last fall. Oh, I opened this place. I was busy. So this year I've put it in another place, but I had, I've been growing garlic for 20 years with no problems, except that maybe it's this wetness. Maybe that's just.
Yeah, I'd suspect that, I can't say because I just don't know for sure and certainly haven't experienced it, but Sure sounds like it. Wetness.
Mm.
Roots need oxygen, right? Roots breathe oxygen like we do, although the green leaves work the opposite way. And if the soil is saturated with water, then there's not going to be any room for air.
Yeah, and I had really
And
heavily
but it's
mulched.
ideal for fungal diseases anyway. Yeah.
I had really heavily mulched that because I had brought some garlic from Italy.
Yeah.
So I thought I want to protect it from the cold winter, and so I wasn't sure if maybe mulching it, and maybe mulching it did keep too much moisture in that more wet spot too.
Yeah.
But I don't remember really mulching garlic much. I wasn't sure if it needed protection from winter or if it was, you know, in there deep enough.
Usually not. Usually the mulching is just
Yeah.
because I happen to have leaves at the time and straw. And I know that if I can take the time to do that in the fall, then I don't have any weeding or watering to do in the spring.
Mm.
It's like
Very good.
seems like it's worth it to me.
Yeah, sounds good. So Ron, we're going to be wrapping it up shortly, but I know there's one more topic that could probably be very helpful to all of us because the community gardens use Meeker's Mix.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if you're familiar with it.
Yes.
Where do you situate it as far as in regards to compost, mulching, all of these things? Like, what do you view it as? And how do you use it?
Well, I although I'm somewhat familiar with it, I haven't used it a lot to really feel I've mastered the use of it, but it is for sure a soil amendment. If there's anybody who doesn't know, it's a composted mixture of throwaway fish parts and cedar sawdust. Now, I think I have reason to believe that Meekers have been experimenting with their formula over the years and probably improving things. But what I have seen that impresses me is that when there has been a problem in the community garden, it's been addressed by throwing a lot of Meekers on the soil surface. It really responds to that. So there's got to be something good in it.
Yeah.
So I also, because it's already composted, or at least partially, I'd have to ask. I would ask at the source a little bit more about it. And what I would ask would be how far through the composting process has it been? Because if it's already fully composted, then it's unlikely to do any harm to to roots that you might plant in it, or sorry, seeds that you might plant it directly into it. So it could be mixed with the soil, almost at any time, or it could be used as a mulch. It's good that way, I know for sure. And I don't suspect, although I still would like to know before I do anything about it, I don't suspect that it is hard on plants the way, say, chicken manure would be. It would burn the seeds or burn the roots of young transplants because it's still not completely mellowed out yet. But Meekers is terrific, really.
Actually, I could speak to that a little bit. I'll tell you a funny story just very quickly. We decided on a couple of our boxes to use it as sort of like at the year that we did the no-till, we put about an inch of Meeker's Mix across a few boxes and just planted directly into that.
Mm-hmm.
And as an experiment, it was yellow beans. And I'll tell you a couple of things. Those were the most beautiful yellow beans we had that year. So it did not burn the plants.
Yeah.
However, lesson learned, Meeker's Mix alone is extremely lightweight, extremely lightweight. So anytime water hit it, all my bean seeds would float back to the top.
Oh no.
So we had to keep, and I didn't clue in, mix some soil in there because the stuff was already planted. So I kept pushing the seeds back down. And finally, at one point, it worked and they stayed down and they rooted. So I wouldn't quite do it that way again, but it did not burn the plants.
So you wouldn't use it as potting soil or planting soil. You would either mix it or you would plant deeper than that.
Well, I was told by the source, like right at Meeker's Mix, that if you were to take just a pail of Meeker's Mix, pure Meeker's Mix, and just plant a tomato plant in it, your tomato plant will grow perfectly fine. And in fact, they had them at the door of their offices.
Yeah. Mhm.
But what I was doing was using it like a layer and then planting the seed in there.
Yeah.
And so I would do that again, but I'd have to weight the Meeker's Mix down more with a mixture of a bit of soil or something, right? Before I planted the seeds.
Yes. Or as an alternative, just poke your finger through the Meeker's Mix well into the soil up to about your second knuckle on your index finger.
Yes.
And so, in other words, you're just ignoring the layer of milk Meeker's
Yes.
Mix on top, and the beans will grow up through it.
Yes, exactly. But it was actually very comical because we just ended up planting in the Meeker's Mix. So the point being, the plants grew, they didn't burn, they produced beautiful beans, and we learned from that.
Yeah. The more I hear about Meeker's Mix, the more I like it.
Yes, yes. Well, we're approaching 6. And if anyone had any more questions or comments, we'd welcome that now. If you have any thoughts, we're still recording at this point, by the way. So we'll maybe thank, Ron, I'm going to thank you now, and I'm going to sign off. And then if there's any sort of housekeeping items at the end, we can do that off recording. So yes, thank you so much.
You're welcome. If you don't mind, before I get cut off, I have a couple of handouts that I offered to Colleen, who will send them around. One of them is planting dates for fall harvest. So if you wanted to do more of the fall planting that I've been pushing, it would tell you when to plant things. And the other thing is I have a fall garden checklist. Not in neither case did I make these up.
Oh, nice.
But they still look useful.
Yeah.
Okay. So
we really appreciate that. There's nothing like a checklist when you're a community gardener. We love those. Yes, so if there aren't any other thoughts, comments, suggestions at this point, we will sign off the recording, and thank you for the session. It was extremely informative, Ron.
thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it.